Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on the power of creative destruction. We're a couple of minutes late. We've been working out how to make Philippe louder, which, as Philippe himself pointed out, isn't normally the problem. So my name's Tim Phillips from the Centre for Economic Policy Research. And so today we will be talking about the problems that we have in society and how we are solving them. At the moment, the discussion seems to be, should we get rid of capitalism or should we make it better? Well, if we choose to make it better, then that means we have to understand better and harness better the power of creative destruction. And that's what we're here today to talk about in the next hour. Specifically, we'll be talking about the arguments in the book, The Power of Creative Destruction, Economic Upheaval and the Wealth of Nations. And of course, the author is Philippe Aghion, along with Céline Antonin and Simon Bunel. And we are delighted to have Philippe with us today. Philippe Aghion of the Collège de France, INSEAD, and the London School of Economics. Philippe, I'll just say hello to you briefly now, just to check that the video and the audio are still working at the moment.
Yeah.
Good, good, good. And so in a second, Philippe will be presenting some of the arguments and research from the book, but we also have a panel for you today, quite a high power panel as well. So I would like to introduce them before Philippe starts speaking. So first of all, from the University of Chicago, we have Ufuk Achit. Ufuk, hello. Good, 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 good. And yeah, good, good. That's what I like to hear. See it. And from, well, just around the corner for me anyway, Richard Blundell from UCL. Hello, Richard.
Hi there. Hello.
Yeah. And also from Berkeley, but luckily not in Berkeley, or else it would be well before your breakfast, Bronwyn Hall.
Yeah. Hi. Just around the corner from you, I think.
Just around the corner as well, yeah. And so the format for today is that, first of all, Philippe will be presenting, then all our panelists will have time to give their thoughts. We're going to make sure that there's plenty of time for you to ask questions. How do you ask questions? Well, you use the little Q&A tab at the bottom of your window, type them in, and then they are there. Even if you do not want to ask a question, then please go to that tab and vote up the ones you think are best. And that's because if we don't get time to answer all of your questions, which is usually what happens, then it means that at least I know which ones that all of you are interested in. We do have a finish at 3 o'clock UK time, at just under an hour from now. So I'll get on with it. And I'm sorry if we don't have time for all of your questions, but I'm sure that there'll be plenty of interesting material between now and then. So first of all, I'd like to hand over to Philippe. Philippe, welcome to present the arguments from his book.
Thank you very much. So it's a pleasure. So thanks very much to Ufuk, Bronwyn, and Richard for accepting to be on this panel today. So the book, this book written with Céline Antonin from OFCE and Collège de France and Simon Bunel from Banque de France and Collège de France, is the result of the outcome of 5 years of teaching at Collège de France. And at Collège de France, it's about making accessible to the public at large research material. And here it was research material on, you know, the Schumpeterian approach to growth. I mean, it's something that we started 30 years ago with Peter Howitt, but then has developed a lot because there have been lots of contribution. Of course, you know, my 3 discussants have contributed and developed this in a major way, each of them, and have their followers and their followers of followers. And so it's a very collective, enterprise that we've developed over the past 34 years to develop models based on the notion of creative destruction, to shed new lights on several aspects of growth and development, and to confront predictions with microdata. So maybe we move on. Next slide. Next slide. So creative destruction is the process whereby new innovations displace old technologies, make old technologies obsolete. Next slide. So based on that, the Schumpeterian paradigm, which we elaborated with Peter Howitt in 1987, and was very much developed, and has 3 main ideas. The first idea is that long-run growth results from cumulative process of innovation, where each innovator builds upon the shoulders of her or his predecessors. Second idea, innovations result from entrepreneurial activities motivated by the prospect of innovation rents. And the third idea is creative destruction. New innovations displace all technologies, make all technologies become obsolete. Next slide. Of course, at the heart of the process, there is a contradiction, because on the one hand, you need monopoly rents or innovation rents to motivate innovation, but to a large extent, they are not only motivated by rents, but rents play a big role there. But on the other hand, there is a temptation for innovators to use those rents to prevent subsequent innovations, because they're afraid themselves of being destroyed by subsequent innovators. And regulating capitalism is first of all, how to manage this contradiction. Schumpeter himself was deeply pessimistic about the future of capitalism. He thought that the first innovators would turn into entrenched conglomerates that would prevent subsequent innovation and stop the system. In fact, there is a lot of his worries in what I will talk about. There is a lot of reasons to share Schumpeter's pessimism, and yet we believe that there are reasons to be optimistic. It's an optimism of the will that we advocate in the book. Next slide. Thank you. So we do three main things in the book. First thing, we revisit some main enigmas of the history of economic growth. The second thing, we question some common wisdoms in policy advice. And the third thing, we try to rethink the future of capitalism. So let me talk about those three in turn. Next slide. Historical enigma. The first enigma is industrial takeoff. So next slide. In fact, we know there's been various episodes of growth long before the 19th century, but they were never long-lasting. And the long-lasting, the successful attempt to generate sustained growth occurred only 200 years ago. 1820 in England with the steam engine revolution, then France and US, and why in Europe, and why so late? And in fact, the most convincing explanation, we believe, is very much Joël Mokyr. And Joël Mokyr explanation very much parallels the Schumpeterian paradigm that I outlined above. First, you needed cumulative innovations. Well, printing, and then in the 18th century, the encyclopedia, the French encyclopedia and the Encyclopedia Britannica made it possible to codify knowledge. So there were progress in universities and encyclopedia to make it possible to have openness and to build upon predecessors, to have cumulative innovation. The second condition was protection of property rights. The Glorious Revolution in England, the French Revolution gave rise to systems that would better protect property rights and would favor the emergence of innovation. And the third one is creative destruction. Why in Europe more than elsewhere? In China, whenever you would have a successful innovator, he or she would be prevented to pursue by the emperor, would be afraid of losing his power. In Europe, if you would persecute a scientist, he would go to a neighboring country and develop his invention and ideas elsewhere. And that country would compete with the country of origin. So that made it, of course, easier to have sustained creative destruction in Europe, because you have this cross-country competition in particular. So that's very interesting, because it plays out, the very much, mapped to the Schumpeterian framework. The next one, next slide. Another enigma is secular stagnation. Next slide. Why is it that here we look at the average annual TFP growth rate in the US over 3 periods, and you see that the TFP growth went up on average yearly between 95 2005, but then since 2005 there is a growth decline. And in fact, there's been various papers. Ufuk worked on one with Sina Ates. There's been work by Liu and Sufi. I did some work with Clino and co-authors. And it's the stories we develop are always in terms of leading firms that innovated successfully in the past, becoming a barrier to innovation by other firms. So there is this, we very much point one way or another to discouragement effects that might be responsible for the decline in TFP growth. So it's again the innovation of yesterday become a barrier to the innovation of new innovators that would try to, and the question is, what can you do there? One thing we emphasize with Clino and co-authors is competition policy. Ufuk also in his paper, there might be a way in the US to reform competition policy, to adapt competition policy to the digital era in order to put an end to the decline, to reverse the decline, you see, and so that's the fight, the optimism of the will. It's not a lost cause. You can adapt institutions in such a way that the AI and IT revolution can give more of their growth potential, because you would adapt institutions to that. Next slide. that shows, yeah, next slide. Yeah, I will. Another enigma is the middle income trap. Some countries grow fast. Next slide. For example, Argentina had a per capita GDP that was a constant fraction of the US per capita GDP between 1870 and 1930, but then Argentina doesn't grow as fast as US. So it seemed that up to a certain point, Argentina was doing okay and then stopped doing okay. But you have other countries like Korea, grew very fast between World War II and the late, the late 90s, and then started to grow, to slow down. You have even an advanced country like Japan who grew very fast between World War II and the late 80s, and then started to slow down. And there, the view which we develop in the book is that, you have some, during the catch-up period, you have some big firms, conglomerates, and those conglomerates not only block new entry, but also necessary institutional change to move from catch-up growth into innovation-based growth. And for example, we knew that for innovation-based growth, you need competition. You need to move towards more competition, more trade liberalization. But those conglomerates would tend to oppose the necessary move towards higher competition and liberalized trade, which would favor frontier innovation. And so that's, again, you have the Schumpeter dilemma. Next slide. Another historical enigma is inequality. So next slide. We all know about, that's the Piketty, Saez, Atkinson curves, explaining that if you look at the share of income of the top 1% income earners in the US or the top 0.1% income earners, it has gone up sharply since the 1980s. Next slide. But in recent work with Richard, with Ufuk, Antonin, Richard, and David, we, in the Review of Economic Studies, we showed that, in fact, part of the increase in the top income inequality has to do with innovation. At least a fourth or a third of the increase is accounted for by innovation. And here we are showing the result of cross-country panel, cross-US state panel regressions, where we look at the effect of innovation intensity on the horizontal axis on various measures of inequality on the vertical axis. The continuous line shows the effect on top income share, on top 1% income share, and the dotted line shows the effect on Gini. And in fact, we show in that paper that those are not just correlation, that these relationships are causal, and we find that there is first a positive effect and significant of innovation intensity on top income inequality. And that's very much related to the Schumpeterian framework. When you innovate, you get innovation rents. In fact, these rents is not only for the innovator, you share it with the owner of the firm, with co-workers. That's very much work I've done with Ufuk and Otto Toivonen, which we talk about in chapter 10 of the book. So you generate top income inequality with innovation. But what's very interesting is that you see the dotted line is horizontal. There doesn't seem to be an effect of innovation intensity on the global measures of inequality like Gini. And the reason is that, next slide, is that in fact what we show in the same paper with Ufuk, Richard, Antonin Bergeau, and David Ebus is that it seems that more innovative places in the US are also display more social mobility, and it's particularly innovation by entrants that generates social mobility. Why? Because you have the creative destruction. Creative destruction means that the new people replace old people. That generates social mobility. And because innovation, on the one hand, generates rents, and on the other hand, generates social mobility, the overall effect on global inequality, we see that there doesn't seem to be an effect that distinguishes innovation from other sources of top income inequality, like lobbying. Lobbying also increases top income inequality, but lobbying means entry barriers, so it reduces entry, it reduces social mobility, and therefore we show that lobbying increases not only top income inequality, but also the Gini. So lobbying is a bad source of top income because it's not good for growth, and it's not good for social mobility, and it's not good for global equality. Whereas innovation, it's true that it increases top income inequality. And on the other hand, it increases social mobility, it's growth enhancing, so it doesn't seem to increase global inequality. So innovation is a better source. So we say better have Steve Jobs than Carlos Slim. Carlos Slim is the lobbying guy, Steve Jobs is the innovation guy, and we contrast the two. In the chapter 5 of the book, we talk about that well. Okay, next part. The second thing we do in the book is to question common wisdoms, things we should not do. And because I don't have much time, I will talk only about the first one. one common wisdom you hear is that you should tax robots to protect employment. And in fact, in recent work, and we talk about that in chapter 3 of the book, it's very much based on work I've done with Xavier Jaravel, Céline Antonin, and Simon Bunel. So if you look at the next slide, we look at the effect of automation on firm level and plant level employment in France. And we have a plant level and firm level panel data. And we show that, in fact, firms that automate, they increase employment. In fact, there is an elasticity of 0.2 on impact at the time of increase of automation by 1 unit, and in the long run by 0.4 elasticity. And so, you can look at whether it's skill, on-skill, middle skill. For all skills, employment goes up, actually. And you may wonder, because it's true that machines should replace manpower. How come you increase employment when you automate? And the reason, next slide, is that firms that automate, can we go to the next slide? Yeah, the firms that automate, they, in fact, they become more competitive, they become more productive, and therefore they can reduce export price. And so we look at export price or quality adjusted export price, and we see that firms that automate, they reduce export price. So they become more competitive, they increase market. So next slide, we see that firms that automate increase sales. So price can go down, sales go up, the market size worldwide go up, and because of that, they employ more. So there is a substitution effect, but it's more than counteracted by a productivity effect. So now, would it be a good idea to tax robots? No, because if you tax robots, you would make it more costly for firms to innovate in the sense of automating, which would prevent them from increasing market size and would prevent them from employing more. So taxing robots might not be such a great idea after all. So that's one example. Can we go to the next slide? We discuss other, common wisdom. One is that taxation is the only way to make growth more inclusive. I believe very much in taxation. You need taxation to pay for free education of high quality, for health system of high quality. You need taxation to pay for labor market policy, for industrial policy. So we need very much taxation, and we need progressive taxation. But it's not the only way. Next slide. For example, we know, I already said that innovation makes, is an element of making growth more inclusive. And the next slide, that's very much based on work I'm doing with Richard and Antonin Bergeau and Rachel Griffiths. You have the continuous line. Those are innovating firms, the firms that patent. The dotted line are firms in the UK that don't patent. And we look, and the horizontal axis is the age of the worker, how long the worker has been in the firm. And we see that innovating firms on average pay higher wage, but also provide a steeper wage profile to their workers. So firms are also, innovative firms tend to give more prospects of social mobility to the workers they employ. So taxing is great, but overtaxing capital and discouraging innovation, you might shoot yourself in the feet, because it would discourage innovation and growth, and also, at the same time, it might also be bad for social mobility. So I want to go on, because I don't want to spend, let's go on, no, let's keep going, because I don't have time, no, more. Now, the third thing we do in the book is to talk about rethinking capitalism. COVID was a revelator. It revealed in the US a broken social model. In Europe, it revealed an inadequate innovation system. So let me talk about this briefly. How long do I have? How many more minutes do I have?
Could you do it in about 5 minutes, Philippe?
Absolutely, that's all I need. That's all I need.
Good.
Okay, so next slide. So here, that's we talk about that in chapter 11. That's taken from Case and Deaton. It shows the mortality, the evolution of mortality of the white non-Hispanics aged between 50-54 uneducated in the US, not fully educated. And it shows that you had a sharp increase in mortality since the 2000s in the US. But if you look in most other countries, you didn't have the same at all. And let me contrast the US with Denmark. Next slide. So Denmark is the work of Alexandra Roulet. It's very interesting. And what Alexandra Roulet does is to compare the health of Danish workers whose place of employment closed between 2001 and 2006 with identical workers in all respects, age, experience, skills, but whose employing firm did not close during that period. And what you see here, it's a diff and diff. You see that the workers whose working place closed you see no difference here. It's the annual probability of purchasing antidepressants, anti-anxiety, or sleeping pills. No effect on that purchase of being in a firm that closes. Okay. Another one. Next slide. Here you look at the probability of visiting a hospital for cardiovascular disease. No effect on that. And there are similar things on mortality. No effect on mortality either. So it seems that Denmark has found a system that works well, the flex security system. When you lose your job, you get 90% of your salary for 2 years. The state helps you find a new job and retrain. It seems that this system is really working very well in Denmark, but not in the US. You don't have the same. Let's move to the next one. Here we look at the effect of COVID on unemployment and probability of losing health insurance. So the gray triangle is the share of unemployed in the US. Okay, but the gray circled is the fraction of people without insurance, and that increased during COVID in the US. At the time where you needed health insurance, a fraction of population lost health insurance. And whereas in Germany, which are the curves in black, you see the bottom curve, which is the share of German citizens without insurance, is always zero throughout. It doesn't change because of COVID. Similar, next curve, next slide, sorry. Here is the circle gray, is the share of people falling into with risk of poverty, on the risk of poverty in the US. It went up during COVID. It didn't change at all in Germany. That's the circle black curve. And so in that sense, you see Germany, but even more the Scandinavians and the Europeans more generally are much better at insuring against COVID shock and against the risk of losing unemployment than the US. So that on that side, US is not doing as well as Europe in terms of social protection. But now let me move to innovation. Next slide. If you look at the right-hand side column, at the number of biotech patents per million inhabitants, the US dominates everybody else. And if I were showing triadic patents, it's even more obvious. If I showed top 5% cited patents, even more the US dominates everybody else. Okay, so it's just no question. And because in fact, and we explained in chapter 12, the ecosystem of innovation in the US is much better. Basic research in biotech, you have the NSF, you have the NIH, you have the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, you have all these institutes, you have very well-founded universities. In France, when you go to a university, you feel that you are in the third world, much better founded basic research. They have venture capital, much more developed. They have institutional investors, much more developed. And they have the famous BARDA, Biologic Advanced Research Development Agency. Next slide. The BARDA spent about $12 billion on things related to COVID, vaccine, diagnostic, therapeutics, whereas at the same time, Europe as a whole spent only $4 billion. Next slide. If you make the addition of the sum of European Commission, European Investment Bank, it's barely you achieve a third of what was spent by BARDA. So there is no mystery. You see, the ecosystem of innovation is incomparably better in the US than it is in Europe. No comparison. So next slide. I'm almost done. So what you would like is to combine the good side of the American model with the good side of the European model, the innovative side of the American model with the protective and inclusive side of the European model. Some people believe that it's a trade-off, that the lack of protection is the price to pay for more innovation in the US, or that the lack of innovation is the price to pay for more protection. And more inclusiveness. I don't agree with this. Let me give you two particular items. First one is flex security. When in Denmark, they introduced the flex security system on the labor market that I mentioned before, not only it made creative destruction work better in Denmark, so that was good for creative destruction and innovation, but on the other hand, it made the Danish system more protective and more inclusive. So that there is no and or, it's an and. You can do things that are good for both. And the other instance is education and lost Einstein. Can I go to the next slide? Here are 3 papers. The left-hand side, each of these represent the probability of inventing as a function of parental income. Okay, so the left-hand side is the Bell et al. Paper in the QJE based on recent US data. The middle is Ufuk, John Grigsby, and Tom Nicholas, historical US data. You see the great similarity of shape. And the right-hand side is based on work with Ufuk and Ari Aitinen and Otto Toivonen on Finland. And in all cases, you see that having a high-income parents increases a lot your probability of inventing. So in the paper with Ufuk and Otto, we really much relate that to education, because of course school is free in Finland. So it's very much because high-income parents are also more educated parents, and they give knowledge and aspirations to their children, and that's why. And so it's very important to invest in education. So investing in education for several generations, as Ufuk has shown also in recent work on Denmark, a very influential paper, it's very important. Doing that, it will be good not only for innovation, because we have many more people who can be in the pool of innovators, but it's also good for inclusiveness. And so you see, it's not an or, it's an and. You can act, you can do something that makes you both more innovative and more inclusive at the same time. And I think I'm done. Next slide, I think I'm done. One thing I want to say is that very important, the triangle between firms, the state, and the civil society. Firms innovate, but as I tell you, very often, incumbent firms want to prevent new innovations, and they may collude with the state, at least with executive power. So to some extent, the separation of powers between executive, judiciary, and legislative can mitigate that problem. But sometimes you very much need civil society to give content to the constitution, to give content to the separation of power. Next slide, and that's the last slide. Constitutions are indeed incomplete contracts, we stress in chapter 15, like my work with Bolton and with Alesina and Trebi. But civil society plays a crucial role as a means of ensuring the effective enforcement of constitutional contracts. An example is, of course, the civil rights. We know that after the Civil War in the US Constitution was amended to introduce the 15th Amendment, giving African Americans the right to vote. But many states in the South, if not all, use poll tax or unfairly implemented literacy tests to effectively disenfranchise African Americans. And it took the Civil Rights Movement to get the Voting Rights Act of 1965, banning voters' literacy tests and making the 15th Amendment from a written thing from notional to effective. And though the triangle is crucial, and we play out this triangle whenever we talk about green innovation, when we talk about inclusive growth, this triangle between state, between firms, state, and civil society is the way to avert the pessimistic prediction of Schumpeter. I think I stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Philippe. And we will bunch the questions together at the end. There's some coming in here, but let's put them all together at the end and hear from the rest of the panel first. And we'll take it in the order of Ufuk, Richard, and Bronwyn, if that's okay. So Ufuk, can we hear from you now?
Absolutely. So thank you very much for having me. And I would like to thank Philippe and co-authors for writing this beautiful book. Obviously, the book is very impactful, also doing a great job in also summarizing the contribution of the exponentially growing literature that highlights the importance of creative destruction. Of course, economists have been thinking about the process of economic growth for a very, very long time. But Philippe and Peter have brought a new angle through their theory, where they highlighted theoretically the importance of creative destruction for long-run economic growth 30 years ago. And since then, using this framework as a workhorse, we learned a lot. And indeed, of course, now we have more and more microdata where we can understand better firms and individuals and entrepreneurs. We need a theoretical framework because, of course, when you have a lot of data in front of you, you need to have a discipline, and that's typically, the problem that economists or researchers or more specifically also students are facing, right? When you have a data, how are you going to analyze the data? And we typically use theoretical models to operationalize the data. And so that's why I think, having an influential, realistic framework of innovation and economic growth is very important to understand the data. But second, it's also important to do counterfactual policy exercise because, of course, when you want to develop a medicine, scientists are doing experiments in their labs. But what do we do as economists? How do we run our experiments? Well, we are running our experiments using economic theory. We build the realistic models where we are trying to capture firm behavior, inventors' behavior, entrepreneurs' behavior, workers' behavior. And then we do counterfactual policy exercise in terms of tax policy, in terms of subsidizing firms, in terms of opening up to trade, for instance, removing the trade barriers, etc. And that's why it's very powerful to have a realistic endogenous growth framework, so that we can not only understand the process of economic growth, but we can also shed light on what we could do for the future if we play around with policy tools. So that's why I think this framework has been extremely influential, that Peter and Philippe wrote 30 years ago. And we've been, both, all the researchers on this panel and also more broadly in the literature, we've been building on this framework. And we uncovered many things that are summarized very nicely in this book. For instance, the first thing to recognize is that, of course, we know that innovation is important for long-run growth, and Paul Romer's model was highlighting this. But innovation comes with very important incentive problems, especially with very important political economy problem. And when you really think about creative destruction, suddenly you realize that innovation doesn't come so harmlessly in some sense, right? Because when somebody comes up with an innovation, for the next innovation to take place, that previous incumbent has to be kicked out by the market so that the next inventor can implement his or her idea to the market. But that suddenly creates a whole new debate, right? Because as a new entrant, all I have to do is come up with a radical innovation so that the market will turn their attention to me. But as an incumbent, to make money, either I can come up with an innovation, or alternatively, as long as I block entry or as long as I block competition, I can still continue to make money. So suddenly you start, once you start thinking about the process of creative destruction, you suddenly realize that innovation incentives are not the same across the economy. So as a result, you cannot think about one size fits all type of industrial policies. For instance, if you think about, oh, let's subsidize R&D, you know that R&D subsidies will not be utilized in the same way by all the players in the economy, because some players' incentive is to come up with the next big technology, but some firms' incentive is to use all their effort, all their money, all their investment to defend their territory and create potentially, a patent wall or patent thicket or you name it. Or alternatively, I can also use my investment money to buy out the companies around me and to kill future competition. And this is even more true in today's day and age, where most of the valuation of the companies is for the future. And when they are small, they don't necessarily reflect on their market value, but because their technologies will be utilized or will get materialized in the future. So that's why they don't even get recognized by the competition authorities, because the M&A valuations are so small. The competition authorities don't even pay attention to those tiny buyouts. But normally, these small entities will change the future potentially, but we don't even realize those things. So as a result, I think it's really important to understand the process of creative destruction. And we've seen also this in our research. For instance, with Bill Kerr from Harvard, when we looked at the quality of innovation and the size of the innovation, size of the firms that are producing those innovations, you see a massive heterogeneity. Typically, when you look at the firm's life cycle, early in their life cycle, they do most of their radical innovations. But later on, they start tinkering over their earlier technologies. And later on, they mostly focus on just building, junk patents around their core technology. Because for many reasons, but, let me not go into those details. But that's one exercise where we see already in the micro data that as firm size is growing, firms' incentive to do innovation is changing. Another example that we saw was when we look at the Italian economy, for instance, with Salome Baslanza and Francesca Lotti. We looked at the firm's innovation behavior as they're dominating the market versus firm intensity to get politically connected. Meaning that, of course, there are many politicians in the economy where some of them are doing the politicians as a part-time job. Think about local politicians, for instance. They can also work for a firm at the same time, but firms can get connected to the system or to the political system by hiring these local politicians to their firms. So in one of our exercises, we merged the register of local politicians to social security data. And what we saw is that as the firm is becoming the dominant market leader, innovation intensity of the firm is declining, but politician intensity of the firm is increasing. And this already tells you that they are trying to get connected to the political system because it's in their best interest not to necessarily innovate, but to make sure that all the deals are going in their favor. And the last thing I want to mention on this is that when we look at the US economy, for instance, when we look at the mobility patterns of the key inventors across firms, what we see is that typically large dominant incumbents are hiring key inventors from other firms in the economy. Well, you might say this is a better allocation of talent because large firms have more resources, and if they hire inventors from rival companies, potentially they're going to make better use of those inventors. The answer is no. What we see in the micro data, for instance, is that large incumbents, when they hire an inventor from a rival, they pay blockbuster salary, but the innovativeness of the inventor just goes down. So it's not a better allocation of talent. It's getting worse. When these inventors who are proving their creativity in smaller entities, when they get transferred to large incumbents, they are not necessarily becoming more innovative. So when you look at the micro data in any country, it just jumps at you. The tension between incumbents and entrants, it's just all over the place. And first, we have to recognize that in the process of economic growth, there is something called creative destruction, and it comes with a big tension between incumbents and entrants. Once you recognize this, then all these policies that we are implementing has to be also filtered through this notion. And as a result, potentially, all these well-intended policies can potentially make things worse because, for instance, when you subsidize firms, typically all those subsidies are going to large incumbents because they have an army of lawyers who are just good at utilizing all these subsidies in the economy. And even though, you're trying to encourage more innovation by small entities, that's not what happens in the end. It's typically all these subsidies that are given uniformly are being utilized by large incumbents. So I think that's why we have to also take into account this political economy aspect of innovation and creative destruction. I'll end on this note. And again, I would like to thank Philippe and co-authors for writing this fantastic book. And thanks for inviting me to this panel.
Thanks very much, Ufuk. That was yes, nice, yeah. And so, Richard, I'd like to ask you to speak now.
Great, thanks very much. Wonderful to be here. Beautiful book, clear and accessible. So congratulations, Philippe, Céline, and Simon. Fantastic. I wanted to pick up on two themes, and as is my typical way, I make a few slides. So let me just see if I can do that quickly. Can you see what I'm looking at there, Tim?
Yes, yep, that's
yeah,
fine.
great. So, oh, yeah, there they are. So I just kind of reflecting on this, and I'll be quick. People can read the slides if they want, but it's a powerful idea, creative destruction, as you've heard Ufuk describe, and Philippe, of course, the excitement of it. Fantastic. And I wanted to pick up on these key themes. I find them very interesting. In fact, that's where I've been involved, the original kind of innovation theme and the recent inequality theme. And I think they fit very well with the way policy design is going. So I wanted to end with that. It is interesting, you don't get good work like this without a lot of research. And as Ufuk says, there's 30 or more years of work here. And Philippe and Peter were developing this, and it was a terrific, and this interplay that Ufuk described so well between the kind of theory and empirics is a real characterization of this work. And you see it very, very nicely in the book. And, in the early days of finding competition mattered, that was less in line with Schumpeter than we might have thought, but market size mattered too. How do we solve that? the beautiful theory of Philippe and Peter had the answer, and it's a really key one. And this approach has really provided a wonderful environment for the interplay between theory, empirics, and policy. And I recommend the book just for that, reaping enormous returns. And as I say, holding out the prospect of the Holy Grail in policy. The Holy Grail, to me, is kind of getting over and above what often is thought of the trade-off between innovation and growth and inequality and social mobility, the points that you've seen there, the ability that we might be able to think of policies that can maintain innovation and growth while reducing inequality and increasing social mobility. And I completely agree with the way this is described earlier. In fact, there's kind of two great insights here that I took from this, and you get it straight from the book. One is, as we just heard described, is this powerful insight on the role of incumbents, entrants, and competition, just to get the dynamics. Remember, growth is often a kind of very exogenous process. Here, it's a strategic interaction between incumbents and entrants, and that's a key point here. What, of course, we've all realized recently, and the tension is there, and Philippe showed it very dramatically, but we know this. There are winners from creative destruction, and there are losers too. And winners like to stay in that position, and they like to keep where they are. We all know that, whether it's a winning family, a winning parent, or a winning firm, winning owner. And that's, of course, a key hold up in the growth process. So getting the balance right. What's rather been fantastic from my point of view about this, and I think it comes out clearly in the book, is the way the kind of theory and empirics work. And I've been involved in this, and I think it is a rather beautiful kind of side to this. The early work on the inverted U showing there was a trade-off between innovation, competition, and you can have too much competition. You can also have too little competition. And going into the weeds of that is exactly what Ufuk and others have been doing. Also, this idea that competition can really have a big effect on frontier firms, but a very poor effect on laggards. Laggards can be in areas that geographically position, so we can have, the wiping out as part of creative destruction of local geographic needs. So a real problem there. And then comes the inequality case. I just went through the different implications, and I'm going to not even describe those. People can see them. These do hold up in data quite nicely. What I wanted to do was go a little bit to the inequality point and then end on a couple of policies, if that's right, Tim. So creative destruction generates inequality between winners and losers. It's kind of an exciting way of thinking of it. In the short run, innovation benefits those who generate it, but in the long run, those rents get dissipated through entry and imitation. Innovation by entrants increases social mobility, but entry barriers can lower this. And the empirics kind of show how important that is. And this social mobility and the dissipation of rents are not guaranteed. And that's really where policy comes in, and this kind of holy grail that's achievable, but can go all wrong. It's rather like meritocracy, in fact. And the winners from creative destruction will have every incentive to protect their winning position and prevent new entrants. And we saw, and you can think through lobbying, patent laws, labor laws, social insurance and education policies can all be designed in a good way, but also in a bad way. And indeed, the reduction of social mobility that then can take place can then have a knock-on effect on innovation and growth. And we may be in a very poor equilibrium, actually, even with creative destruction. And so what this book does is bring those ideas together extremely well. And I think the idea that innovation can be too low and inequality can be too high, and that you can design policies and think through how to get that balance right. And of course, we know there's evidence that this kind of balance isn't right, and things are getting worse with incumbent firms and incumbent families gaining a kind of stranglehold on entry and upward mobility. And so I am with this kind of thought, which I think you get very clearly from the book, and that can we design a policy to get a better balance. And I think we can. Philippe's idea is to combine the US and Denmark. I think we can think across a range of policies here. And the power of creative destruction, in my view, is to create a kind of coherent understanding of the balance of policies against inequality, towards inequality and growth, but bring in the role of competition policy, education, technology choice, anti-lobbying, training, social insurance, kind of in a way that allows you to kind of think them through in a balanced way, not separately but together. So policies that can generate more innovation and less inequality. It's a really hard thing to get right, but at least we have this kind of framework gives us the chance of achieving, as I said, the Holy Grail. So an important book at a key time. So congratulations to the authors, and I'll stop share at that point.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Richard. Incumbent families, there's a phrase that does quite a lot of work, doesn't it? Bronwyn, would you like to finish us off?
Yeah, I sure would. I'm not gonna use slides, just in the hope that I'll finish in time. First of all, I thank you for having me, and I'm also very happy to have had the opportunity to read the book this week, and because I'm a long-term admirer of Philippe's work and his co-author's work, and I probably wouldn't have gotten to the book quite as fast if it hadn't been for this event. So it's extremely thought-provoking, and I had thoughts in many areas, but I'll discuss two, which are closer to my knowledge and interests. One was about patents, the limits to patents, and another one was about the performance measurement problem. The limits to patenting, the book makes, because I'm a big patent data user, so I'm critiquing my own work too. But the book uses patents rather heavily as measures of innovative activity, precisely because it's one of the best measures we have. Particularly, it's one of the best measures we have by individual technologies. It's available over many countries, long periods, et cetera, and this has been well known for a long time. And so it's very appealing. But I think when you start thinking about long-term growth, welfare enhancing innovation is considerably broader than technological innovation. And so it's just, I want to remind ourselves that, even sitting in London, which I am at the moment, we know that clean drinking water to prevent cholera was a very important innovation, and a growth enhancing innovation. The benefits of hand washing in surgery and in general in medical procedures is another one. And these are not patentable things, but they had big impacts. I think even the use of the internet as a facilitator for transactions between individuals, that idea itself is not really patentable, but it's had a huge impact. And so forth and so on. In other words, I want to sort of broaden the concept of innovation. The second thought I have on the limits to patenting is not related to the data problem, but it's related to something that Ufuk actually alluded to, and which is discussed in the book, in the middle income trap area. But it's I want to push it a little further. A lot of the models of incumbents and entrants emphasize property rights to innovation as a way to create the temporary rents to innovation. And this is true. I mean, this is true enough, it's an incentive and it's a way to protect temporary rents. The problem is that if you're in the middle income area and you're trying to learn to innovate by imitation, patents taken out by multinationals or, developed country agents can actually hamper your industrial development. And in fact, the key examples of successful industrial development that I know about, which is, the US in the 19th century, Southeast Asia, and even now China, were conducted in an environment where they were able to ignore to some extent patents held by outsiders, The US simply didn't have national treatment. And we have a problem now, which is that the TRIPS agreement at the World Trade Organization essentially mandates uniform, to some extent, I mean, there's qualifications here, but to some extent, uniform patent protection around the world. And this is not actually to the benefit of developing countries. It may not affect the least developed countries, which are far from the frontier, but it does have an impact on countries that are trying to catch up to the frontier, because it's harder for them to learn via imitation. So I just wanted to qualify that. Ufuk referred to the other aspect of patents, which is a problem here. It's very similar, it's related, which is that this entrant who wants to enter sometimes needs to acquire the right to enter from the incumbent, because the incumbent holds a patent which he needs the rights to, and that is because at the moment patents are being used much more strategically than they were in the past, although they were used somewhat strategically in the past. That is an area where we need to actually pay attention, because it's one of the mechanisms by which you prevent entry. Okay, now I want to shift gears and talk about productivity measurement and the productivity slowdown. And I have two thoughts here. One is the internet has shifted many costs onto users, as we are all well aware of, because we're spending more time conducting transactions on the internet, filling out forms on the internet, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that to some extent it's lowered the incentives to test websites on the part of firms or governments, and to get the data entry correct, et cetera, et cetera. And this leads to an enormous time wasting on the part of individuals. And my suspicion is that this is part of the problem in the productivity slowdown in developed countries, particularly in the US. That there's just an enormous amount of time wasting going on with the shift to the internet. It's not going to be the whole explainer, but my guess is it's part of it. The second thing that concerns me, especially as a resident of California, I'm all for regulation when it's well designed and well intentioned, but we do have a great deal of regulation which comes about because we're trying to reduce risk to zero, and that I think does raise costs. We also have quite a bit of regulation which is directed towards climate change mitigation or environmental, safeguarding the environment. And those things are not going to be fully reflected in measured output in GDP. And on the other hand, they're costly. They're costly to firms. They're particularly costly to smaller firms. And so that's another, that's another reason why that might help to explain productivity, slowdowns in productivity growth, because time is being spent on things that are not showing up in GDP. Now, my reaction to this is that using GDP per capita as a benchmark is actually problematic if what we're trying to do is improve the environment or improve health or reduce carbon use, because we're not giving ourselves credit for the things that we're doing to achieve those goals. There's some of it, some improved health will show up in GDP per capita, but not all, particularly improved health of old people like me, because our productivity doesn't matter. And I've been wondering whether we should try to find another benchmark. I mean, people have talked about measures of new economic welfare, back to Nordhaus and so forth, and even Tobin. But we haven't really, as economists, we're still fixated on GDP per capita, and I'm not convinced it's the right measure in developed economies anymore. So I just throw that out as a thought for future, further future research. And I really want to thank Philippe and Céline and Simon for this wonderful book, which I'm very grateful for.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn. We've got a couple of minutes, Philippe, so I'm going to have to put a couple of questions to you very quickly on this one. I've got a question from Dominique Forêt, who provided an email. So he's really been waiting for his answer for a couple of days, really. And he points out that you said that innovation needs democracy. How do you square that with the success of innovation recently in China? There are a couple of questions in asking about what's happened in COVID. Can we categorize what's happened in COVID as an episode of creative destruction because of the rather arbitrariness of the destructive part of it? Is it creative destruction? And also, can we elaborate a little bit on what we do, what the welfare consequences are for the people for whom creative destruction, they know very well that it's a net negative for them personally? You're on mute, Philippe.
So you would like, how should I answer the question? Should I respond to the discussants first, or first to Dominique?
Anything you could, we have very few minutes left, Philippe, so anything you can do to squeeze it together.
Yeah. Okay, so first let me, I'm so grateful to the discussant. They did, I took plenty of notes, and they did, I got so much out of the three discussions, and I cannot do justice to them because there was so much there. So let me start maybe with Dominique, and then I move to the innovation in China. Look, I mean, of course, you can see on many grounds that China is patenting a lot, and there has been a lot of, and of course, I'm not a China expert, and I'm sure, my discussants know more than I do, but so they, in many ways, they've gone much more frontier than they were. I mean, they've got as close to the frontier as we could, and they innovate a lot. My question, and I don't know yet the answer, so I don't have, is that can they do Kuhnian innovation? Voilà. Can you, in the absence of freedom, do really very radical innovation, new ways of thinking? I don't know about that, but that's the question that I am obsessed by. I'm sure you can go very far in imitating, adapting, improving. How much can you do? Can you find a completely new paradigm in the absence of freedom? Well, and also, to which extent maybe China can get around it, because many Chinese scientists co-author with people in the US, or they travel to the US and they cater to freedom. They pay free ride on freedom elsewhere. You see that? So I am wondering, and I don't have the answer to those questions. I'm currently thinking about them, but those are questions I'm asking, and I don't have the answer. COVID creative, obviously COVID creative, there are new ways of doing things. There are things that we won't, there are things that close down, but there are things we won't do as before. I will probably do more Zoom conferences. I will use much more medical consultation online. There are many habits that will change, and maybe new activities will start. But I think it will probably accelerate. It's true that in France, for example, creative destruction went down during the past year because the French government protected the whole economy. So the rate of creative destruction went down by almost 40%. But now it will resume. And I think there are some things that will not be like before, other things that will, and there will be, activities that will cease to be the same after than they were before. And so it will be very interesting to see what continues, what goes back to before, what does not go back to before, and how to manage that. So that brings to the question about welfare consequences. All depends on the labor market system. If you have the Danish system, creative destruction is not as bad a ride as it is in the US. Again, you go back to Alexandra Roulet versus Deaton case. It all depends how you accommodate the creative destruction, but what kind of labor market, institutions you put in place to, at the same time, to accommodate or not accommodate the creative destruction. Very quickly, I mean, so I think both, the three discussants were doing a stellar job, and I cannot do very briefly on patents, but I'm sure on measurement. I mean, we mentioned some measurement problems. I think I took notes of Bronwyn mentioning others. We know there are a number of measurement problems. The big question is that is the measurement only the main responsible for the observed decline? I think it is part of the story, but it's not the. I think it's not the whole story. So there we have the debate with Siverson, Cook, Bronwyn. It's part of the story, but it's not the whole story. I think there is, to a large part, this discouragement effect. These large firms, these leaders, that had a discouragement effect, and the competition policy that does not follow suit with the IT and AI revolution. But I think there is both there are involved. But I think we have to stop, I guess. No, we are all what Brandwitz said about the patents. Of course, there are limits of patents. We touched a little bit about the limit of patents in the chapter 10 on basic research, and I had done some work myself with Fiona Murray, Scott Stern, Jeremy Stein, Matthias Watt-Ripon, on of course the basic research, and of course why you don't want to patent theorems and basic research, and the limit of patents. Bronwyn mentioned a number of reasons why patents can be an impediment to to innovation. If it abused, and for example, we had the debate on vaccines. Should we remove the patent on vaccines? So there was a big debate there. So there is the work that Michael Kramer did in '96. Saying maybe you have to balance the innovators' incentive versus the diffusion motive, and how can you find systems that compensate innovators that allow you to diffuse? So the role that states can play, or the community of states, or sovereign wealth funds can maybe repurchase vaccines, or and then rediffuse. You see what I mean? And so a bit in the line that what Michael Kramer started to think about in '96, and is now currently pursuing this. And I know Bronwyn, and I know there's a lot there, but there is always this very tension, not completely discourage innovation by still making sure the innovator gets something and still be able to diffuse. And we always get, back to this contradiction. There were many questions there, but I guess we are off. The time is.
We are completely out of time, Philippe. We're over time. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry for that. So thanks so much again. It was a fantastic exchange, and I took plenty of notes. It would be, and thank you so much for organizing this, and thanks to Richard, Bronwyn, Ufuk had to leave, and thank you so much. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. We got the notes for the next book. Yeah, there is plenty more to discuss on this. If only there was some kind of book or something we could consult to find out more about it. So thank you very much for everybody. I don't have time to say goodbye from everybody, so if we could all just, sort of like say goodbye at the same time. Thank you very much to Nadine and Mandy at the CEPR for doing the organization around this.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
And we will see you again.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks.